welcome to the November EPERN seminar. It's great to see you all here. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Santiago Gangotena to the EPERN seminar. He's a faculty member at the Universidad San Francisco de Quito, and he works in the College of Business Administration. He's also a member of the Experimental and Computational Economics Lab. And some of you might know him as a graduate of the George Mason economics program. So Santiago, thank you for joining us here at EPERN. Thank you for sharing your project with us, and the screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. I know a few of the people here from the Mason program. Just want to make sure everyone can see my screen okay now? Yes, right. Well, this work is based on the chapter I wrote for Wagner's Festschrift volume. And originally I was going to focus only on network effects, but in building the model, I realized there's so much more that can go on here that focus shifted over time. There's still a little bit of network effects in there. That is what I want to get to. But right now, I think this is a great place to share what I've done so far and get some feedback, hopefully, on where the model is going. What's the motivation for this? Well, the motivation is pretty straightforward and simple. There's plenty of literature now written on entangled political economy, and reading it is a lot of like reading Menger. When I read Menger, it's almost like it's written for programming. It's begging to be programmed. It's very sequential. There are sets of steps that agents undergo. So the aim was to turn the basic entangled political economy framework into an agent-based model, a very simple model at first, so that it could be flexible enough to instantiated in different applications. That's the aim. Like we know, economy and polity in an entangled political economy are entangled processes. They're processes that interact. They're not independent of one another. And what my concern is with the social configuration of economy and polity as the emergent outcome once people are allowed, and not allowed in terms of the model, but once we realize that people can undergo political and economic interactions as they try to carry out their plans. So the objective is to build this simple general model that captures the idea of dyads and triads as the basic units of economic and political interaction. And from that, see if we can get a working model of an entangled political economy. Why do this? Well, my reasons are two of them, but there could be many more. My two main reasons, like I said at first, is I wanted to continue the work from that chapter in the Festschrift, exploring how network effects can arise in entangled political economy. And also to answer the question if we can view this social configuration, and I'll be much more specific about what I mean with social configuration, but if we can view the social configuration of polity and economy as an emergent outcome, instead of one thing is designed, polity is designed over here, and then economy functions within those rules, or going the other way around. We have an economy, and then we overlay a polity on top of it. Well, what happens if we allow both from the beginning, and let's see what comes out. I think the best way to understand the model is to do this little thought experiment first. And this is a little bit like the economist joke of assuming a can opener, because I'm going to assume a lot of things, but bear with me for a little bit. I know this isn't the best crowd probably to make unrealistic assumptions, but there will be a lot of unrealistic assumptions to get to a workable model. So first, let's imagine a world where people can generate enough resources to survive on their own. This means that they have to interact with others. The question is, how are they going to interact with others? Two people meet, two strangers meet, and different outcomes of this interaction are possible, or different types of interaction are possible. They can both, or one of the parties unilaterally can decide violence and try to take the other person's resources. I don't look at bilateral violence, I assume it away in this model because I don't think it would add that much more, but if you say differently, please do. Again, I'm hoping to get as much feedback to make the model a bit richer. So that's one option. People can attempt to have bilateral violence. Another option is they can ignore each other. I don't consider that possibility either because, well, they ignore each other. It's as if they hadn't met. The interesting possibility is when they decide to interact economically. And here, economically I use it in a very broad way, simply to signify that both people will gain from the exchange. One way that we can imagine this gain would be a simple coordination game where two people have produced different goods and they're trying to coordinate on comparative advantage, who specializes in what, and afterwards they trade. I want to abstract a little bit from what exactly the interaction is going on, simply to say that they have a positive sum interaction. And this positive sum interaction is a dyad. When we have two people, that's about all the options of interaction that we can have. When we have three, it gets a lot more interesting. When we have three people, not only can we have three different bilateral dyads, or three different dyads, sorry for the redundancy, we can have three different dyads between the three participants, but we can also start having now coercive relationships. So when three people meet, two of them can get together, form a coalition to coerce a third into giving part of their resources to the aggressor coalition, as I named them. And this is the basic idea of a triad being the unit of polity. Of course, we can have different types of interactions once we have three people. I just mentioned one of them, which we'll call it a zero-sum political interaction, or a zero-sum triad. Why zero-sum? Well, because the two people that form the coalition are going to extract resources from the third. The third one loses, the two people in the coalition gain whatever the third one loses. Here, yes, I'm not taking into account Tulloch's point about this actually being non-zero, because, well, let's imagine the resources are already netted out. So there's no resources being spent on maintaining the coalition, or on maintaining the triad, or maintaining the dyad. So once they form this triad, we're going to assume that this is a semi-permanent relationship, and here they can keep on interacting. Well, of course, we can imagine much greater coalitions, right? Once we have four people, it starts getting more interesting. We could have 3 against 1, and there are many different ways of forming this 3 against 1. If we have 5, we can have 3 against 2, 4 against 1, all sorts of different coalitions. I want to bar them from the moment and simply only look at triads. Because in the end, 3 against 2, 4 against 1, we can look at it as an expanded type of this zero-sum triad. There can also be resource-generating triads that are interesting. So, for example, 3 people getting together to drain a swamp, as in the classical Buchanan public choice example of collective action. So the 3 people can get together and decide to clear a swamp. All of them gain. It's a triad. There's no bilateral interaction. All of them gain. But it's different than the positive sum interaction we have with the dyad, right? In the dyad, we have a quid pro quo exchange. With the positive sum triad, well, the first thing they have to do is they have to try to solve the free rider problem, but one of them can simply watch as the other 2 works, or pretend to work as the other 2 clear the swamp. And one way of doing that could be also by forming 3 triads, right? We have 3 people, and they all come to an agreement that they're going to form a coalition against the one that that's not working, against the free ride. And if all of them agree to this, then we might be able to have a positive sum interaction. This is something I want to add to the model, but right now, this is ruled out by assumption. We have no positive sum political interactions. What would the world look like if this thought experiment we're carrying out, what would the world look like if the conditions in this thought experiment were reality? And that's where I try to go with a model. So the 2 units, we have here an example of a dyad. We have simply 2 people with their smiley faces following Wagner's diagrams, and it appears in a few of his books. Economic interactions are positive sum, and like I said before, we can imagine this is a coordination game of comparative advantage in trade or any other game, but finally the point is that both of them win. And we can have our other unit of interactions, which is this triad. Here it gets a bit more interesting. We have a yellow link between two agents. The yellow link signifies that these two agents that are joined by the yellow link have formed a coalition, and they extract resources from the third agent, and that's the red arrows going from the third agent on the bottom to the two agents in the coalition. They're extracting resources from it. Here we have an example of what a social configuration would look like if these are the units of interactions. Recall we have yellow arrow, green links between people to signify dyads, and we have the yellow and red links to signify triads. So here, for example, I've labeled them 1 through 5 sequentially going from left to right, top to bottom. We have agent 1, if we just focus on agent 1, he has an economic interaction with agent 4. There's a green arrow joining both of them. But agent 1 is also in a coalition with agent 2 against agent 3. So we have agent 1 and 2, the two on the top, that are extracting resources from the third. Of course, the third must get his resources from somewhere else, so we have to look at what agent 3 is doing, and agent 3 is also a part of two dyads. Agent 3 is having a positive sum game with agent 5, and agent 3 is also in a positive sum game with agent 4. We have some other things going on here as well, and we could go through each one of the agents, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and extract all the dyads and all the triads. And the point here is that interactions are entangled. There is no unique way of interacting. Each person in his different capacities can be part either of economic exchanges, but at the same time of different political exchanges. And here, perhaps the most interesting one is agent 5. Agent 5 on the bottom left, agent 5 is in economic interaction with agent 3. So they're generating resources through this productive relationship with agent 3. But at the same time, agent 5 is part of a coalition with agent 1 to extract resources from agent 4. And we can keep adding levels of complexity. This is just a simple example of what types of social configurations we can get once we allow dyads and triads to happen at the same time. So that's a little bit in way of background. Let's get to the model, and I want to show you the model so you can see how it runs, see some of the main results. Disclaimer, this model is based on Halvarian's methodology of how to build a model in your spare time. And one of the important things here is don't look too much at the literature, because you'll be conditioned by what has already been done. So I haven't looked too much at the literature, and instead what I would like to do is, if you guys have pointers to different parts of literature, if you say someone already did this, I'll be very sad, but also very happy, because it won't be too far off track, but that's a possibility. So please bear with me. If you can think of other models that have already done this or something similar, please point them out to me so that this can grow. All right, so what does my model consist of? We have agents that are going to consume resources to survive. Like we did in a thought experiment, they can't generate resources on their own. Thus, they have to find other agents to form dyads or triads with in order to get resources for themselves. They can only get resources either through positive sum economic interactions, dyads, or zero sum political interactions, triads. Their resource income that they gain from forming dyads or triads can be saved from period to period as wealth. And this wealth depreciates at a constant homogeneous rate for all agents. This is a very parsimonious model. It's very symmetrical, so the results are also symmetrical. And what's interesting is that when you start with a very symmetrical model, you can start building some asymmetries in, some heterogeneity in, to get some more interesting results. But right now, it's a very symmetrical model. So wealth depreciates for everyone at a constant homogeneous rate. And agents whose wealth falls below a certain threshold die. They exit the market, and their interactions disappear along with them. The initial conditions of the model, well, I give my agents, initially my agents start with a certain level of wealth, which is identical for all agents. They also have the same initial probability of either selecting to interact economically, try to form a dyad, or interact politically, try to form a triad, or form a coalition to coerce a third. There's also exactly the same income, just in imaginary units right now, of income from their economic and political interactions. And the topology is also symmetrical. So there's an equal probability of matching any two agents given their strategy. How are interactions, or what do interactions look like? How are they formed? Well, first, agents are going to choose a strategy. And here we label the strategy set S, can be either 1 or 0, where 1 signifies try to form a dyad. Their strategy is going to be try to form a dyad if their strategy is 1, or 0, which means try to find another agent who's in a political mode of interaction to form a coalition and look for a third party to coerce and extract resources from. And like I said before, the topology of interaction is random matching. There is no structure to how agents interact. The only structure here is going to come from their history and how they update their strategies over time. But initially, they have the same probability of choosing 1 or 0, such that we should expect some symmetry. And actually, what's interesting in the model at this early stage is that the symmetry breaks very early on based on their path dependence. So just to expand a little bit, when an agent chooses their strategy as 1, they're going to look for another partner that also has their strategy as a 1, another partner who also wants to interact through an economic mode. And they're going to form a dyad between each other, and they're going to earn a certain amount of income in terms of resources, i.e. each period. With the triad, it's a little bit more complex, very little bit, but a little bit more complex, where two agents, in this case, the two agents on the top, have chosen the same strategies, 0. They're going to choose a political strategy, they form a coalition, and then they go in search of a third agent who can be in any strategy mode, it doesn't matter. And they're going to coerce him into giving over some part of the resources. And that's the income the coalition, each member of the coalition earns each period. They earn income IP. And the coerced agent, the unhappy one on the bottom, is going to lose that exact same amount of income, which he's giving to the other two. Our agents are also going to be able to learn. So this is how they update their strategies as time goes on. And it's a very simple reinforcement learning algorithm at this point. And I don't know if it really needs to be that much more complex. We can get to that in the discussion. Right now, it's a very simple reinforcement learning algorithm for learning. So what are they going to try to learn? They're going to try to choose the strategy that gives them the biggest payoff. So this is where they're acting rationally, in a sense. How exactly do they do this? If you're familiar here with literature, this is what's called the bucket brigade algorithm, but it's very simple that I think we can describe it fully. So all agents begin at the beginning of the model with a strategy set. The strategy set simply is a list that contains the both possible strategies, a 1 and a 0. And in their first period, they're going to randomly choose one strategy from the strategy set. Let's suppose that they choose 1, for example. They choose a strategy from the strategy set, they choose 1, and they form a dyad. Now they're going to update their strategies. And how are they going to update the strategies? They're simply going to look at, well, where am I getting most of my income from? If most of their income comes from dyads, from economic interactions, they're going to add a 1 to their strategy set. Thus, next period, it's going to be more long, or their strategy set becomes updated. We can see here, ST equals 1. They have added a 1 to it. Next period, they're going to be more likely to choose a 1. And they do this period after period. This way, there's a declining marginal probability from the successful strategy, but you tend to go toward that strategy which gives you the greater income over your lifetime. So there's path dependence in the choice of strategies here. And there's a learning that tends to go either towards the zeros or the ones. One way to see that if the model is not working would be if their strategy set stays random. There is no path dependence. They're not learning from their past experience. And we'll see that, in fact, we do get a large degree of learning. Agents tend to specialize either to political modes or economic modes. And one other thing to note here is that victims don't penalize political interactions. What do I mean by this? Well, when they're choosing what strategy to add to their strategy set, they only look at their income. They don't look at their expenses. So well, that's an interesting way of saying it. They don't look at their expenses in the sense of the following. If they're a victim, it doesn't matter that they're paying to different aggressor coalitions. They don't look at this as a negative thing about choosing a political strategy. Because again, here's a little bit of the realm of the non-logical choice. They're not evaluating being a victim as part of the choice to interact economically or interact politically. And again, this is also because the same agent can be part of dyads and triads. And when they're part of triads, they can be part of the coalition in some triads, but they're going to be the victims of other triads. Just highlighting how different levels of political interaction are overlaid. And we can be part of net recipients from political processes, but net taxpayers in other processes. The sequence of events in the model is first agents choose their strategy from their strategy set. Then agents are randomly matched to form dyads, only agents that have a 1 as their chosen strategy. Agents that choose 0 are randomly matched to form triads. Again, forming a triad simply consists of finding another partner to form a coalition and then choosing a victim. It doesn't matter what state or what strategy the victim has. Then agents get paid their income based on the number of dyads and triads that they belong to and in what capacity they belong to the triads. Agents update their wealth. Their wealth is depreciated. They lose a constant fraction of their wealth from period to period. And then agents with insufficient wealth dies and their interactions are removed. And after this, time moves one step forward and the model continues, where we go from steps 1 through 7 once again. If you have any questions at this point, maybe it would be good to, if you have specific questions about the model, because here I just want to show you the model. Can I confirm if everyone is looking at a strange screen with, looks like a pentagram there? No, this isn't anything about that. Yes. So the model is built on NetLogo. NetLogo is a programming language that's fairly easy to set up prototype models. I do want to go with this to Python a bit, something more extensive, because building triads is a pain in NetLogo, and Python's a little bit easier. But I'll also make this available if anybody wants to play with this in the future. And it's kind of fun. You can spend hours just running the model. So let's run the model. Here in the black foreground, in the black background, you can see little blue dots. I don't know if I need to make this bigger, I can make it bigger. So let me know if you can see it well, or if I should make it, let me just make it a little bit bigger just in case. Okay, there we have these little blue people. Those are our agents. We have green ties between them, or green links between them. Those are the dyads. And we have dotted yellow lines. Those are the lines that join two members of a coalition, and red arrows, which point to the victims of the different coalitions that are there. This is the end of one run in the model that gives us an example of how we can have coexistence of economic interactions and political interactions. But let me run this again. So some of the main results here, we're running the model with 46 people. The initial level of wealth is 5 units of wealth per person, and their economic income and their political income is exactly the same. The death threshold, so the threshold of resources that they need to have at any point in time so that they don't die is simply set to 1. And consumption is, or depreciation, how the wealth depreciates, is 79%. It's 1 minus the parameter here called consumption. And let me just run it slowly. We run it one first tick, and since we have random matching, immediately a lot of economic and political links are formed. We can keep doing this and keep doing this, and we see how the model is evolving. Our population, recall we started with 46 agents, is now down to 13. Some agents have died because either they haven't been able to form any links, or more resources are being extracted from them than what they can produce. Let me just run it now continuously so we can see what happens. And in this case, we have unraveling. So no stable economic, not enough stable economic links were able to be formed, such that all political links basically extracted all the resources from the few economic links that existed until everyone dies. Here we have a few graphs where we can see how the model evolves. In this set of 4 graphs, the one on the bottom left is the number of dyads and the number of triads that are formed in the model. We can see that there's a fast rise in the number of triads in red, and rise and then fall again of the number of triads. The graph above shows us the relative frequency of dyads and triads. So this could be a nice way to look at social configurations. Out of all the interactions in society possible, how many of those interactions, or what percentage of those interactions are political, what percentage of those interactions are economic? And this is what this graph here is capturing. We have a graph for the population and a graph for specialization. I'll get into specialization in a moment with a model that doesn't unravel. So let me see if I can, since here we have a random seed every time period, let me see if quickly we can get a stable configuration to emerge. I think this is going to do it. No, this one unraveled as well. Okay, let me just set the random seed to one that I know gives me a stable configuration. Right now, them moving around is just a way to visualize them. Don't pay any attention to how they move around, only to the links that they're forming. And here I think we have a nice stable configuration. It persists in time. What does this mean? That the network of dyads and triads that has formed endogenously here is such that economic relationships are creating enough income to support all the political interactions that are also going on at the same time. And this is an emergent outcome from a very simple model, which I would say this is your very base level, or it could be a very base level of an entangled political economy, where we have both type of interactions. If we look at the frequency of interactions, and this run is very typical, around 60%, here are these numbers, E-link frequencies and P-link frequency give us the numbers for E-links, economic links, the green line that tells us how many, the percentage, out of all interactions, the percentage of them that are dyads is around 60%. And in red, around 39%, we have the percentage of interactions that are political. And this is a typical configuration of what evolves. I still haven't been able to run it enough times to get a sense of how often do we get stable configurations versus how often do we get unraveling. My initial guess right now is around 20%, but I could be very off, so don't remember that number. The interesting thing is what happens to specialization. So recall that agents are learning strategies. What does this mean? Remember that they have a strategy set, which is basically a list of ones and zeros, one signifying if they're political interactions and zero signifying 1 signifying economic interactions, 0 signifying political interactions. Because they have this strategy set and they're adding to the strategy set the strategies that are successful, simply by looking at the fraction of ones in this list gives me an idea of how preponderant at the level of each agent are economic interactions. So for example, an agent whose strategy set is only ones, they're only ever going to choose economic interactions. On the other hand, an agent whose strategy set is composed only of zeros is only going to choose political interactions. We never really get, or we never get only ones or zeros. We always get some portion because sometimes their income is fluctuating as other agents are dying, as new dyads and new triads are being born. Their income is fluctuating, so the strategy that they're adding to the set is fluctuating as well. So if we could simply look at the percentage of ones and zeros that they have in this list, we have an idea about, at the level of each agent, how specialized they are. If an agent only has ones, again, he's very specialized in economic interactions, the closer to 1 you are. The closer to 0, you're very specialized in political interactions. And here we can see a histogram on the bottom right of these 4 graphs, a histogram of exactly this, the percentage of ones in each agent's strategy set. And being a histogram, it tells me, well, how many are closer to 0? Here it's divided into quintiles. So we have, if the percentage of economic interactions is between 80 and 1 on the far right, the far bottom right, again, percentage between 80% of your strategies available to you are ones, up to 1. And the second quintile would be around from 60 to 80% of your strategies are ones, and the bottom quintile is between 0 and 20% of your strategies are ones. And what emerges is very nice. We have a peak on the last quintile and a peak on the first quintile. What does this mean? Most agents are either very much towards or have between a 0 and 20% chance of choosing economic interactions. If we're closer to 1, this last bar here, this tells us that how many agents have between an 80 and certainty, or 80 and above % chance of choosing economic interactions. The fact that it's a lot of agents on one end and a lot of agents on the other end tells us that there are some agents that are very specialized in economic interactions and some agents that are very specialized in political interactions. This is a quick way of looking at it, but we can also inspect directly their strategy sets. So let me bring that up here. And just the highlighted portions are the actual strategy sets of each agent. It's, again, just a list of ones and zeros. So for example, the first line here that I'm highlighting, person 15, that's person 15. He's somewhere here on this graph. Person 15 strategy set begins like everyone else with a 1 and a 0, but he's added 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and I can keep on reading all the zeros. And then all of a sudden he switches towards 1 because he's starting to make more income from economic interactions. And we can do this for all the agents, and we see a fairly large degree of specialization. It's not like they alternate between political and economic interactions each turn. Okay, let me go back, or let me just run one more run. So this is a small model with 46 people. Again, what's nice about NetLogo, we can have some scale effects, see what happens as we increase the number of people. This is a small run with 46 people, but we can almost make it as large as we want. Let's say we go up to 500 people interacting simultaneously. One of the things that I do tend to see in the model is that the greater the number of people, the smaller the odds of unraveling, which makes sense as there are more chances to form sustainable interactions. So with 500 people, it's going to be a little bit slow with zoom on. Let me turn off and we can, oh, there we go, already finished. We can look at this model here unraveled again. We have another unraveling. We can see that usually when the number of triads goes to 1, that means we have everyone, or we only have political interactions, and this is when the model unravels because not enough resources are being generated through economic interactions and everyone dies. So again, I'll make this model available for anyone who wants to play with it. That's always a good way of finding bugs, and well, I'm pretty sure that this one, at this point, this one doesn't have any bugs, but finding bugs and looking for new avenues to go with it. Let me go back to my presentation now. How are we doing with time? Okay. So just again, this is at the models here is at a very simple preliminary stage. The model is very symmetrical, so we do expect the results to be symmetrical. As we add some more structure, and I'll detail how that structure can be added, we should get some more interesting things. But at the very base level, I think this is already a model, or what could be a model of entangled political economy, which can be built upon to get more complex things. So what are the preliminary results for this model? Well, like I said before, the model unravels for some runs. All agents die when there are too few economic interactions relative to political interactions. What's interesting is that this is completely path dependent. What do I mean by this? Well, with the same exact parameters, global parameters for initial wealth, economic income, political income, for some runs we get unraveling, and other runs we get stable configurations. So if we have, for some models, for some runs, the model unravels, other runs, the model does reach a stable configuration with the same parameters. What must be causing the difference is the sequence of events, how people are getting together to form dyads and triads. So we have path dependence. When we get stable configuration, we get around a very stable, and this was the part that worried me the most, that we have a very stable, not only is the configuration stable, but the social configuration that emerges, in other words, the percentage of dyads and triads out of all the interactions, tends to go to the very same numbers. It's a very, very tight distribution, around 65% of dyads and 35% of triads. You've seen a few runs go up to 80% dyads, but it tends to be very tight around here. Right now, what I want to do is have some more time with the blackouts. I haven't been able to do it, but run the model a few thousand times to get some statistics of the distribution for these parameters. There's a large degree of specialization in strategy space. So measured as the proportion, again, of ones and zeros in their strategy set, we have agents that tend to have a lot of ones, agents that tend to have a lot of zeros, but not that many agents that have an equal number of ones and zeros. So we have a lot of specialization. And the specialization isn't only path dependent, because we do have a lot of switching. So, for example, agents that start with a lot of zeros don't always end up with a lot of zeros, but they can start with a lot of zeros and then go to a lot of ones, such that by the end of the run, they have only a lot of ones in their strategy space. Like I said before, the stability or unraveling is path dependent. The model is very symmetrical. So the matching algorithm, also called the topology of interaction. That's just a fancy way of saying how people get together to interact. The matching algorithm is very symmetrical. There's an equal probability of any two agents interacting. So this is almost like imagining people randomly walking around and meeting others and interacting, which isn't very realistic. So what I want to go with this is to add a bit more of a complex topology to this. Have an initial social network already exist, and limiting people so that they can only interact with their neighbors or their neighbors' neighbors at a maximum. And other models that are similar, not in the political economy space, but in network effects. Heinrich has a very nice model in 2018, where he shows that once you add this more complex topology, you get a lot more interesting things that start to happen. Like some sections of the network of interactions have only the economic interactions, and other sections can have a lot more political interactions once you have this richer topology. And another thing that's symmetrical in the model at this point is the parameters. Agents are essentially homogeneous. They all except for their histories, except for how they alter the strategies through time, they all derive the same income. The income that they derive from economic interactions is identical for all agents. The income that they derive from political interactions is identical for all agents. At this point, we can already start seeing some scale effects in the aggregate outcomes. So more people make unraveling like we would expect less likely. And also more people can support a higher political income. So if we raise the amount of income they derive, or a coalition, an aggressive coalition derives from victims, if there are very few people, the model unravels. But when there are many people, we can extract a higher amount of political income because they have a larger amount of dyads available to them that they can generate income from to pay these political coalitions. So we have these already these scale effects present. And this would probably change in interesting ways once we get more complicated topologies on top of this. Some work that still needs to be done with the model as it is now, and some of the things that I'd like to do to it is, well, we already have some stable configurations and some social network analysis of the topology of triads and dyads that emerges would be interesting to see, for example, if there's a way to measure the degree of entanglement for a specific agent in some way. A very simple way could be, but it seems too simple to be right, but a very simple way of doing this could be simply looking at the preponderance of economic versus political interactions that a given agent is a part of. If you're only in economic interactions or only in political interactions, at the level of the agent, there's a smaller degree of entanglement versus having some economic interactions and some political interactions at the level of the agent. And then coming to an aggregate measure to talk about the entanglement of the social configuration as a whole. And that's something that I'd like to do, but that I'm not exactly sure how to do it yet. Like I said before, different topologies are going to give different results. What I'm scared is that maybe the results are going to be too dependent on the topology, but I have to try it out to see if that does in fact happen or not. How do we take this model to the empirical world? If this is only a toy model, I don't see it as being that useful. And we do have some idea of the scale or the distribution of economic interactions. So for example, if you think of Robert Axtell's distribution of firm sizes, that's in a way a measure of the distribution of economic interactions we have in society. So Walmart, more than 1 million employees, we have 1 million bilateral interactions going on there in just one specific type of a market. And I think we have a bit of a better handle on the extent of the economic in society. But the extent of political has been very hard for me to find any data on. And what I mean by the extent of the political, well, recall in the model, you can be part of many different triads. I pay taxes to my local government. I also pay taxes to my the central government in Ecuador. I'm part of the neighborhood association here in the housing project I live in, and we have a political system here that we vote on different measures. I'm part of also the teachers association at my daughter's school. We're part of many different levels of political interactions, and I don't know if we have any data on the distribution and the relative preponderance of political interactions versus economic interactions. But if we did, that would be a way to tie this into the model in terms of what's the social configuration. And again, social configuration simply is the percentage of economic versus political interactions out of all the interactions. Of course, in the abstract, it's very simple. If we try to go to actual data, that would be a bit more complex to get, but that's one avenue where I'd like to take this to have an empirical tie-in. Here also, one other thing that I think would be interesting to add is making the potential resources a function of the social configuration. So if you recall here, economic interactions always pay the same economic income for all agents for all time, political interactions likewise. But what if the overall social configuration determines what economic resources can be generated through a dyad. And also the whole, viewing it as a whole, the whole social configuration also determines what political income can be gained from political interactions, with probably something like a diminishing returns to having economic or political interactions. But adding this, I think, would make this a much richer model where we may actually get some turbulence and some chaos, because now the income, which in my model is constant, is not going to be constant, but is going to be changing as a function of the interactions that are being generated. And as the interactions are generated, the potential income or resources that can be generated by the model also change. And that might give me some more interesting dynamics. And finally, we can also play around with more sophisticated learning. And here is the tie-in to the chapter in the Wagner volume, where we can, right now my agents are only learning from their own past history. But in terms of choosing economic or political modes of interaction, I think we tend to learn a lot from simply what goes on around us, the prevalence of economic and political ways of interacting in society. If we look at the dyad and the triad as templates for action, well, we're going to look around and see what templates are available. And here it's relatively simple, but I don't have any results yet, so I didn't want to show that model yet. But it's relatively simple to have our agents imitate others instead of simply basing their strategy choice on their past. They're going to base their strategy choice in some percentage on their past, and another percentage imitating those agents that are around them. I wanted to end this with a little bit of a cynical note, in that this model is simply a network generating algorithm. If we strip all the layers of symbolism that we put on this model to interpret it as an entangled political economy, and simply view it as a computer throwing out numbers and creating links when certain conditions are met, not creating links when other conditions are met, this model is simply a network generating algorithm. And as such, at least it does make me question sometimes whether, is this so useful to understand society, or is it simply a nice game with numbers? I like ending with that because it forces, when you build a model, you say, hey, I built something, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work, but it's better to be humble. So yes, it's simply a network generating algorithm, but in the same way that Godin Sunder's famous computational double auction is simply choosing different colored balls from different urns. But as such, it still, I believe, can help us do theory, not necessarily calibrate this to the real world and say, hey, I can predict what's going to happen. No, that's not the point of this model, of these types of models. But I do think it helps us clarify what it means. At least it did help me understand what it means that the triads are a basic unit. And it's great that I have people here that came up with that idea of triads and dyads. Thank you. And I can ask, am I getting it right or not? Is this the underlying concept or not? So thank you for bearing with me. That's all that I have to present formally, but it'd be lovely to get some feedback and chat about this model a little bit.
All right. So yeah, thank you, Santiago. Very exciting. Wonderful to see sort of this net logo interpretation of the dyads and triads. That's definitely the step in the right direction. Let's open it up for questions. And I see that Jim already has his hand up in the air. So let's go to Jim.
Thank you for the talk, Santiago. I enjoyed your working through these ideas. And the beautiful thing about modeling, I think you've shown that to everybody, is that you get to imagine what the world looks like, and then you get to make that world. And you have to ask, how can the world look like that? So it was a nice exercise just in thinking through that process. I have a few comments thinking about, well, let's just start with relevant models. So keep toying around and don't look at anything until you feel like you really need to. But you're definitely, so we published an article in JAS a few years ago, looking at sort of alliances and the impacts of resource availability through alliance networks. It was not a generative network model. We just sort of imported the structure from existing treaties. But it would be really interesting to use a lot of the same sorts of rules. Thinking through specifically when you started talking, and then I remembered, I said, oh yeah, we had this model. The Hobbesian notion of the jungle is not just that the strongest man or strongest, well, Hobbes was thinking about men, but the strongest party is going to dominate, but rather you're going to have coalitions formed. And those coalitions then are going to dominate. So you have the coalitions already, but there's something about attributes that drive coalition formation, attributes that drive whether or not you're going to, it says I'm done talking, we'll lower your hand. Oh, I don't know. Anywho, attributes that are going to drive coalition formation and whether or not you are going to choose violence or you're going to choose productivity. I'm just curious about if you have attributes like that, or is it simply strategies that are sort of arbitrarily chosen? And then the other suggestion I would have, if you really want to make the model to especially to get out of these situations where you run out of agents, it turns into kind of like a black hole. If you bring new agents in, and this can be arbitrary, right? Just sort of generate new agents that can participate, and then you get a competitive frame still. But by bringing new agents in, you're bringing in new knowledge sets. And so not only is imitation a good thing, but you want to refresh the knowledge set, because when you start getting imitation, you converge to particular strategy sets, particular parameter values. But if you bring in new agents, and that can be through reproduction of an agent or multiple agents, or it can just be arbitrary, generating new agents. Whatever it is that you choose, at least that's a way, an opportunity to bring in a new knowledge set to the model that then will help make the results or make the network more robust.
Thank you, Jim. Those are great comments. I know the JAS paper you're referring to. It. I think that was with what's her name?
With Julia Harold.
Yeah, Julia. Yes. Yeah. I know that paper. Now that you say it, I will definitely look at that. And here in this model, yeah, just to answer, there are no attributes. It's simply just a very abstract strategy. Adding the attributes, and now I think that there's enough work done in empirical or analytical narratives about entangled political economy that I can look at that literature and try to add attributes from there instead of just simply imagining attribute A, attribute B, attribute C, but actually have them have some substance. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Otto?
Oh, my turn. Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a really cool paper because, you know, I think you're illustrating a lot of the basic operating principles underlying the dyadic and triadic model, and I think that there's a lot of potential in the, you know, developing this further and doing spin-offs of this and all that. I have two questions. One of them is very technical, and the other one is I guess more of a speculative comment. But so the technical question I had is, so I didn't fully understand what the so in this model you have dyadic and triadic strategies yielding the same income, right? So there's no so what I didn't understand is how the payoffs for those strategies can shift over time if they are the same, because the agents can switch strategies based on the yield, but how is the yield changing? Not because the unit yield is changing, but because of the sort of yield over time is changing. I don't fully understand exactly what's driving that. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes, of course. So let me just share screen again so it'll be a bit easier to explain this way. So what I mean when I say that the income from political and economic strategies are the same for all agents is that, let's look at the link between agent 1 and 4. The agent 1 top left and agent 4 bottom right have a yellow green arrow between them. That means that agent 1 is going to get economic income 1 and agent 4 is going to get economic income. And that income the income that each gets is the same. How can it change over time? Well, by forming new links. So agent 4 is going to get 1 unit of economic income from his link with agent 1, but he's also in an economic tie with agent 3, the one in the center. So agent 4 in total, he gets 2 units because he's a part of 2 diets. Agent 1 is only part of 1 economic diet, so he's only going to get 1 unit of income from his 1 diet. So maybe the best way of saying it would be, and labeling the variables would be to say that the price or the unit income that they get from each interaction is the same for all agents, but because you can be in a different number of interactions, the total income that you're going to get is different. I don't know if that explains it, that makes it clearer.
So basically they're adjusting their strategies not really based on, there's no strategic reason to adjust except pure path dependence. I mean,
it's pure path dependence.
Because they could get the same income from forming any link, right? So,
and here you can make it a bit more sophisticated, have them have some type of a predictive model to think about what's going to yield greater. But at this point, I wanted to make it as the learning as simple as possible, because sometimes the learning dominates everything else. And here we want the structure to be a bit richer before the learning dominates.
And I guess one way in which you could have different strategic payoffs is that dyadic relationships don't die out over time, but triadic ones can die out over time. So you could have expected returns would be different, I guess, over time if you can anticipate the deadly results of some triadic yields, but over time. But my sort of second comment or question was about the purpose of the model and the what do you think is the prime motivation for doing it? Is it to illustrate something we already know, or something we already sort of have a non-mathematical or sort of differently modeled, non-agent based account of? It is simply sort of retranslating that into a different language, or are you trying to also garner new knowledge about something that could be retranslated back into the sort of theoretical framework from which the inspiration comes? I mean, do you see that this is producing new knowledge for the sort of basic assumptions, or is it illustrating what already we know, or what the entangled political economy takes for granted?
So the first motivation, very personal motivation, is pure consumption value. It's fun. And that's my main motivation, but it does need to have some instrumental values for others to care about it. And there I would say it's both. On one hand, one of the hard things about, and especially working from the Austrian tradition, is that it's very hard to formalize some of the things that come out of this tradition. And when you make a model, it's a theorem. It's a proof by existence. So it's basically to just say we can play the same game. This is proof by existence. We can play the same game as other work in other veins, in other directions that is being done. But I do think that there's and like Jim said, by building this model, so one is that you do get additional knowledge in building the model because the model forces you to be very precise about what you mean. And the real world gets a little bit sacrificed there because I have to abstract, but I gain in precision. And I think that if you keep a balance between the two, that's a good interplay of theory to model, theory to model, theory to model, and this iterative cycle. But I don't think that these models are only useful to clear up theory. I do think that you can gain pure knowledge simply from the model once it's built and running it. And to me, this comes from the fact that when we're talking about entangled political economy or macroeconomics, which is the other place that I think that these type of models are very useful, is that it's very hard to follow the chain of causation, chain of logic verbally when you have more than 2 or 3 people interacting. It's simply the number of possible combinations of possible coalitions, if you think about this model, grows too quickly. And when things grow in that way, you do tend to get some type of systematic behavior of the model at the aggregate level. And I think that's where these type of models are useful. It's, of course, what's going to happen is what you put in, it's programming. There's no Deus ex machina making something new come out, but you can have emergent outcomes at the aggregate level, which are interesting. So here it's not that interesting yet. At least one interesting one is that you have high degree of specialization and a very stable convergence for the models that do survive. Which, hey, an entangled political economy exists. This is a formal proof. It's not, well, we already knew that, but it's nice to have that too.
Yeah. Wonderful. Can we go to Dave? I know he has a meeting, so can we let Dave ask the question, and I will raise my hand for the next one.
Thank you. So I kind of have 2 questions. One, just a clarification. So first, Santiago, thank you so much for the paper. Apologies that I missed most of the presentation, but the paper is super fun to read, so thank you. Just for me, for my own clarification, the payoffs, even from a triadic exchange, are still positive, right?
Yes.
So like, you know, yeah.
They're positive for the 2 people in the coalition. So for example,
right. Well, hang on. So maybe let me give an example, and thankfully we have Marta here, and this kind of feeds into my second question. So triadic exchange, like I go to a barber, I get my haircut from a licensed barber. I can only go to that barber because the state or the government has said, you know, hey, this person is licensed to cut hair, right? That to me qualifies as a triadic exchange, right? I still benefit from the fact that I go get my haircut. Like there's still a consumer surplus in its base form that I receive, right? I just receive less consumer surplus than I would in an unlicensed, you know, haircut place. Is that so far everyone's like, we're cool, right? Okay, so that leads me to potentially a wrinkle that you could add into this model that might be helpful. You can have 2 different forms of triadic exchanges. You can have a pure rent creation triadic exchange where, you know, can anyone cut my hair? Yeah, I've cut my own hair. You know, did it turn out great? No, but it certainly was, you know, fine enough for the price I paid for it. But you can also have, in like an ideal case, you know, an efficiency enhancing triadic exchange. And so there, you know, I have sort of a conflict in this one. My wife is a doctor, right? She has a medical license, right? She is licensed to operate on the eyeballs of very small children, and she has many certificates that prove that she is competent in this. Thankfully, in her profession, you know, she slices and dices the kids' eyeballs, done, never see them again. So there's very limited repeat play to establish credibility. You know, yeah, we've got Yahoo and all these other rating websites that people could ostensibly go to, but the license to me is an efficiency enhancing certificate that says, hey, this person meets some minimum threshold of competence, right? You can trust them to sell you a service that actually works. Now, I know libertarians, anarchists, whatever, there's all sorts of private, you know, ways to solve this problem. I don't dispute that at all. That would still be if there were a private, you know, oversight or a private licensing organization, that still is a triadic exchange because you still have to pay to have the monitoring and the certification and everything. So there's still a triad there. It's just a non-government. And maybe that's a wrinkle. Maybe you can have a non-governmental, a private certification triadic exchange. I don't know. But to me, there are productive triadic exchanges that enhance efficiency, and then there are unproductive triadic exchanges that just create rents, right? And it might be beneficial for this to include that distinction in some way. I don't know how you do it, right? I'm not an agent-based modeler, but there might be something worthwhile in there, because, you know, at the end of the day, not all triadic exchanges are bad.
Yeah, and thank you, because the thing I've been banging my head against the wall is exactly that. How can I model the positive sum triadic? And it's hard, but the way you're pointing could be the way. Thank you. Yes.
All right, I'm gonna jump in here, and then we will have Jim ask his question. But I don't know, is Dave still? Have you left, Dave? Okay. Anyway, yes, I think that the key to what Dave was saying is what's being forgone, right? Like what alternatives are excluded. So sure, the state certifies physicians nowadays, but we would have other mechanisms to ensure, if it weren't for the state, right? There would be other ways, and they would not necessarily be triadic, because it would be, if you have private certifiers warranting that doctors do a good job, or even if you work with the liability framework, those then become separate diads, right? Like the physician participates in multiple diads, right? But it's not like someone grows at the expense of the other two nodes in the network. But I get it. Like I get your point, and I can see the importance of sort of ironing out that wrinkle. But my actual question for Santiago was, and this is maybe because I didn't understand the paper or the presentation, but I guess if you could elaborate on the choice of the strategy. So in my intuition suggests that you need to have some diads in order for triads to make sense, right? So like there needs to be some wealth creation within the diads that attracts triads, like that, for triads to make sense, right? Is that sort of sequentiality also the case in your model, or do they emerge at the same time?
In my model, they emerge at the same time. So a lot of the deaths that you see in the beginning of the model are from political triads exploiting someone who only has initial wealth but no dyads. And so they're like the early opportunists. I go and I attack someone who doesn't have any way of generating income because they're not part of a dyad. So me and Jim get together and we go attack a third person and extract resources. Sorry, Jim, for coercing you into the example. But the other person, the person that's getting attacked, hasn't formed any dyad yet. We can only extract from their endowment. They're consuming their endowment as well, and then that dyad disappears. So the only triads that survive in the model are the ones that tend to attach themselves either to other aggressor coalitions or to other dyads.
Yeah, I think that also would make, I mean, you know, we're going way beyond your presentation, but empirically, sort of like looking at history, right? Wouldn't that make sense too, that you need to have some, I don't know, like you need to have some wealth creation, some trade, and then that's where the predation would happen. I don't know. I'm thinking of Poland in the 1990s with all the mafia groups predating, like they would attack local businesses and they would sabotage them and take money from them, but only to a certain point, right? Which is sort of the Olson point which you reference. Anyway, thank you. I want to give Jim a chance to ask his question.
If I could just comment, that's very similar to the situation we're having right now in Ecuador, with mafias going around asking for extortions. But going back to the model, what's interesting here is that it would seem that you have to have some initial wealth creation for anything to emerge at all. I think what's interesting is that even if you have them both at the same time, still something emerges.
I think that's very powerful, and that's I definitely keep us updated with this paper, because I think there's so many different applications and sort of ability to play play around with it. But yeah, no, very good, yeah.
Yeah, I think the theme of the conversation really lends credence to the importance of thinking about constraints when you're modeling these networks. Yeah, you're extracting, but extracting comes at a cost, and that cost is probably going to be those who you're extracting from are going to fight back. And you extract until you get some equilibrium about the party who's getting extracted from being okay with a certain amount of extraction, because the cost of fighting back is more, right? So I think if you start thinking about this dynamic of, yeah, there's a choice of production or extraction, depending on the context, but there's also a choice of response when you're being extracted upon. I think maybe you'll start seeing opportunities, like Marta's noting, in extractive networks. Maybe extractive networks also generate opportunities for production that wouldn't have existed before. Maybe productive networks also generate opportunities for extraction that wouldn't have existed. And if you start getting a dynamic between the extracting nodes and those being extracted upon or from, maybe you'll get some higher level structures that you might not have anticipated.
That's exactly where I'm hoping to go with this. And like the example I like to give when I teach this in class sometimes is in Ecuador, where they passed a law that you can't go into a soccer stadium with a belt because there was violence, people using belts. And immediately what happened is that you'd go to the soccer stadium and outside would be these boys with boxes and little tickets, and they'd say, well, check your belts at the door. And well, that's the change in the law created this productive, is it really productive opportunity for people to be checking belts? Well, given the constraints, it is. But I think the whole point of political economy is that, or the entangled political economy, is that you have these networks of rules that come up. And right now, my model doesn't have any of these richer rules that constrain what you can do. So if I take what you're saying the right way, I don't know if I understand exactly what you're saying, but from what I get is would be, for example, in passing this law, that you're constraining the activities, the type of dyads that can be formed, which leads to the you can't go into the stadium wearing a belt, which to me gives me value. That's valuable interaction. But it opens the possibility for different productive activities like checking belts at the doors of stadiums.
Yeah, maybe. So I'll just clarify what I'm thinking, and I'm not sure really how it relates to what you're saying. And this will be easier. Is that so we live in a world with violence. Violence can be used to extract wealth or make threats, just simply in making the other party incur costs, even if it's not an extraction, right? Like dying. And so then you have a choice about fighting back, and that fighting back then can limit the amount of extraction. So literally the amount of extraction is a function of one's ability to defend oneself. And then once we form expectations about what the end result of a battle is going to be, then we can just make a rule, right? So the rule is after the interaction. The rule reflects as Buchanan noted in his discussion of Leviathan, right? The rule should reflect one's access to resources, political and economic. So instead of, I guess, necessarily thinking about, well, what is the right rule? I think the question I want to ask is, how do you get incentive compatible rules to emerge so that instead of fighting and killing each other or stealing and engaging in all that cost, we can more quickly sort of get to the end result of, okay, I guess I'll pay you 15% of my income.
Okay, I see where you're going with it. Yeah, and those rules in an agent-based model or in a model like this, those rules would be, I can see how you could do that with this model pretty easily, in that we'll just have their learning be more sophisticated so that they can form expectations, like you said, about outcome of battles or outcome of these coalitions. And these rules would probably be stable patterns of strategies. So they won't actually come together and let's make a rule, but the rule would be a certain type of stability in the strategies that they form. And because there's this stability, these strategies play out over time, all the time, such that we call it a rule. Or it's an order, it's a pattern. Okay, yeah.
We have one room for one more question. So Zach, and then that we will need to stop.
Yeah, so really cool piece. Absolutely relate on just the joy of modeling and how fun that can be. It's always a good time. You mentioned on the last slide that you play around with changing the relationship between the income from political interaction and the income from economic interaction. Have you, to the point where, you know, if income from political interaction is greater than economic, you have to have more agents, that means it's sustainability. Have you played with that value within a single run? So that relationship changes over time within an individual run, because you could certainly make an argument that the first few economic exchanges are going to have the higher marginal product. The first set of productive relationships are going to be the most economically valuable. And then over time, maybe it slowly comes down and decays a little bit. And then eventually maybe the political value actually ends up becoming greater than it later on down the road. That would be sort of an interesting almost modeling of like Olson's institutional sclerosis stuff and Rise and Decline of Nations, where you could kind of get at this idea that over time, as the economy kind of slowly maybe slows down a little bit, settles into some kind of steady state, the social coalitions and the extractive triads really start kind of taking over and extracting more and more relative value. And then second question, with respect to the point on matching. So when either you're choosing who to extract from, the coalition is, or you're choosing who to exchange from. I know you mentioned some type of social network, but you could really, or would it be easy to just do a sort of very simple preferential attachment based on the wealth holdings of an individual agent? So you're more likely to, if I'm extracting, you know, I want to rob the wealthy guy to some extent. I don't want to rob the beggar. And for sort of dyads, you could think about it, I guess, almost as a sort of way of, the guy who has the most resources probably has the most productive things that I could potentially get from it, and just sort of probabilistically rank agents down the list of who's wealthier, who's less wealthy. But yeah, again, really cool piece. Enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Zachary. Yeah, no, I haven't tried non-constant income, but I didn't think about that at all. I thought of making the income some way a function of the social configuration as a whole, but not having this time varying element that you're mentioning. That I think that would be very cool. We might get some interesting things. With respect to the matching, yes, right now it's simply random matching. There is no underlying social network by which people interact. It'd be kind of the equivalent of a changing random network every time period, which is ugly to instantiate, so just random matching. Yeah, and you can also have situations where, well, I won't attack the wealthy, I'll attack the poor because he won't respond. It'll be easier to extract the resources. And that could be the network formation. That's a very, very nice idea. Thank you very much. Yeah.
All right, and I think this needs to bring our seminar to a close. Thank you all for coming on. Santiago, thank you for this great paper, great presentation. Please share with us updates as the project proceeds. Yes, thank you. And next month will be, I think it's December 19th for our next presentation on the myth of the left and right. So thank you and see you all in December. Bye. Thanks.
Marta, thank you everyone for your comments.
Thank you. Bye.